Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a new series dedicated to the smartest album programming ever. I think this is particularly important because in these days where everyone's dealing with streaming and things are being sold by the track and by internal tracks and pieces of movements and melodies and things, but there is a time, in fact, when albums were thoughtfully assembled, where the couplings mutually illuminated each other, where listening to an entire album or purchasing an album for something that was familiar that you wanted introduced you to something you might have been unfamiliar with and opened up a whole new universe of listening for us. That's all going away. And I think that that's a serious, serious loss. It's part of the electronic media revolution. However, I think that we can assemble our own programs. I'm trying to do it now, as you know, with my series of concert programs that will never be heard. Unfortunately, it's one of the least popular things I've done, even though there's like 150 of them by now. But I'm going to keep doing it. And I know some of you have been on me to do it, and I'll get there, I promise. But I also think it's worth talking about albums that were released that were really smartly put together and wonderful to listen to and conceptually brilliant and, just showed real musical thought and intelligence, because there's so little of that out there. And particularly when it comes to classical albums, they're very simple to do. Most of them you just stick to one composer and you're set. Or you may have two composers. That's daring. Those are the standards. But every so often something comes along where you see some really interesting planning. And I want to celebrate that. I think we should. And so I am going to begin by talking about, let's see, this one. Rachel Barton Pine, superb violinist, on Cedille Records with the Royal Philharmonic, led by José Serebrier, who certainly knows how to conduct this stuff, doing Beethoven's Violin Concerto and the world premiere recording of Franz Clement's Violin Concerto in D major from about the same time as the Beethoven Violin Concerto. Beethoven's was 1806, Clement was a year before. And this is really interesting because Beethoven wrote his Violin Concerto for Clement. Clement, remember, played it with in the middle of it, stopped to play something like Upside Down and call for the it was a circus with virtuoso soloists in those days, and most of them wrote only for themselves. They didn't play other people's music. And Clement's concerto is interesting for a lot of reasons. It really is. First of all, it's a lovely work. It's not a great work like the Beethoven is a great work. It's a very good work, and it's certainly worth hearing. And Barton Pine has done wonderful programming. She's actually does fabulous programming generally in most of her recordings for Cedille. She also did the Brahms Violin Concerto coupled with the Joachim Hungarian Concerto, which was marvelous. But this one's even better because the Joachim is something of a known quantity and the Clement had never been recorded before. One of the things that really fascinates me about Clement's concerto is just how big it is. We're used to these virtuoso concertos, where the violinist or the pianist, whatever, plays something can be 15 minutes long. Sometimes they're big, but most of the time they're formally not terribly interesting, and they tend to feature the solo to the extent of all else, and that means that everyone else is either sitting around or it's sort of abbreviated once the soloist is done doing what they're doing. But this is a big work. The Beethoven, as you know, is like 45 minutes long, 44 minutes of this performance, which is very normal in terms of timings. And Clement's concerto is 41 minutes. It's a big piece. It's 16-minute first movement, 12-minute adagio, 12-minute rondo finale. It's a major piece of writing for violin and orchestra. And of course, Beethoven's concerto was played by Clement and then famously ignored for generations practically until Joachim got his hands on it. It's still one of the largest violin concertos ever written, but it's not crazy by the standards of the day. People tend to think so because we don't play concertos by any of Beethoven's contemporaries at all. And occasionally when one comes up, Viotti or something like that, most of his concertos were much, much shorter than Beethoven's and didn't, exploit classical sonata form in its most expansive way, in the manner that Mozart and Beethoven did. So the Beethoven Concerto, of course, is monstrous, but the Clement Concerto is also very interesting, and quite large and quite ambitious, and the opportunity to hear the two of them together, especially given the fact that Beethoven wrote his concerto for Clement, and this piece was written a year before Beethoven's, really allows us to make very, very interesting and thought-provoking comparisons. And that's why it's great programming. You know, Rachel Barton Pine learned this concerto that no one had ever touched in several thousand million years. Probably no one ever played it but Clement himself. And she gives it a performance which is every bit as fine as her performance of the Beethoven, which is excellent. It's a great performance of the Beethoven Concerto. And that's what unfamiliar repertoire needs. It needs to be presented in the best possible light, with the most sympathetic possible interpretation, so that we have the best impression of it and we can make the sort of comparison that she's asking us to make when we listen to this 2-disc set. So this is what I have in mind by really smart programming, wonderful programming, an excuse for doing yet another version of the Beethoven Concerto, and presenting it in a context which is thought-provoking and smart and respectful of the works, and really would grace any collection, especially for serious music lovers who are always looking to expand their horizons and to think about the pieces that we're being asked to listen to so frequently. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.